Simply Maths Tutoring here. I wanted to make a quick video because I just remembered a chat I had with one of my method students a couple of days ago. And they asked a really interesting question, and the advice I gave them, I feel like it applies to pretty much anybody who's studying maths in VCE. So it's got to do with basically how you work through your textbook questions, because the textbooks are notoriously badly organized, and a lot of the time you find yourself sort of either doing questions that you don't really need to do or not getting to the questions that you really should be working on. So in this video, I just want to talk about the best way to pick and choose out the questions in your textbook so that you can get the most out of the amount of time you spend studying. Check this out. So the issue with the textbook a lot of the time is the fact that most students have a really limited time frame for how long they can commit to studying a particular subject, all right? Most Year 12 students are working on 5 subjects, maybe 4 if you're lucky enough to have finished a 3-4 last year. Either way, you end up with a really limited amount of time to work on a particular subject, which can be really frustrating sometimes. Now, maths in particular typically requires a lot of work because it requires a lot of practice and a lot of time to go through each individual problem, make sure you get all of the practice you need, nail the techniques, the methodology, everything. And what I find with a lot of my students is they get roughly halfway through the chapter and then they actually basically have to give it up because they've either run out of time or have done so much that their brains have just turned to mush and they can't do any more maths questions. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm the first person to say that if you spent your time doing every single question in the textbook, you would be there forever. There is far too much content in the methods textbooks or the further textbooks or the specialist textbooks to be able to cover every single practice question. It is slow, it is tedious, and it is ultimately a waste of time when you're trying to balance 4 or 5 different subjects in Year 12. Having said that, one of the worst things that I see students doing is they go through the first half a dozen questions in a textbook, realize it's not that hard, and then stop. And that is one of the most dangerous things you can do. Not because you're skipping questions. That actually I'm a big advocate for because otherwise you'll be there for days, if not weeks. The issue that I have a lot of the time is the fact that you're skipping the wrong questions. What you're doing is you're tackling all of the easiest questions which make perfect logical sense to you and not giving a chance to the questions that will really start to push you. So if you find yourself short on time and you know for a fact you're not going to be able to complete a particular exercise or the questions in a particular topic, it is okay to skip questions, but what you don't want to do is just skip the second half of the chapter. Instead, focus on the second half of this chapter and skip the first half. So focus on the second half, skip the first half. What you'll find is the questions will be much more challenging but much more valuable for your study, which is really, really important because if you're going to only spend an hour on your maths homework, you want to make sure that hour actually counts for something. And if you just spend your time going through the boring, plain questions in the first half of the exercise, you're not getting anywhere near as much value as you could be getting if you were focusing on some of the more challenging questions. Now, this works out really well because if you find yourself really struggling with these harder questions, that's a good red flag to let you know that you actually do need to take a step back to some of the easier questions and try them first. It doesn't mean that you should leave the hard questions altogether. It just means you might need to take a slight step back, get some more practice before you tackle the more complex questions. The reason the questions at the end of the textbook are so valuable is because they typically combine 2 or 3 key ideas from the topic together, often in unconventional ways. Yeah, unconventional ways. So you'll find that the questions actually force you to think creatively, which is really important in maths because otherwise you're going to run into trouble as soon as they try and throw you a curveball question, which is like 99% of exam questions. So they can be pretty brutal. And the questions at the end of the topic in the textbook are the ones that will let you practice that. So if you're going to find yourself doing, half the exercise because you just don't have time to get through all of it, don't just do the first 6 questions out of 12. Instead, do every second question or even start with the second half of the chapter if you're feeling slightly more confident. If you then find yourself having trouble, you can always backtrack a little to get the practice you need, but then always make sure you finish off those more challenging questions because those are the ones that really test you and those are the ones that will give you the most bang for your buck in terms of the amount of time you spend studying any type of maths. Okay, now these ideas apply to further, methods specialist, and honestly, pretty much any other subject where the textbook involves practice questions. Okay, it's a really valuable strategy to make sure that you're getting the most out of your study time in pretty much any subject where you're relying on the textbook for a bit of practice. So I hope that helps you guys. Anyway, that's pretty much it from me today. So have a fantastic time, keep studying really hard, and I'll catch up with you on the next video. Bye for now.